Hello. This is a podcast to add to the ongoing collection of recordings about Druidry. It was suggested by a friend of mine, Joe, that I do a broadcast on the issue of satire and humour within Druidry and the bardic arts. Her suggestion was partly fueled by the fact that she saw a podcast, if that's quite the right word, or performance, whatever the term is, by Jonathan Pye, the comedian, who was having a big old rant about a court case in which a stand-up comic was convicted of a hate crime of anti-Semitism, fundamentally, after having taught his pug dog to give a Nazi salute, and that put it up on, I think it was YouTube or something like that anyway. He was taken to court because of it, accused of anti-Semitism, and the court found against him. Jonathan Pye was having an incredibly, shall we say, colourful, is the best way to put it, rant outside the court about how ridiculous he felt this was, that the court should consider humour, no matter how tasteless, to be a criminal activity. And it's certainly something that lots of other comedians over the years, not obviously in respect to saluting pug dogs, but with various other cases where someone's made a joke about something that another person has found offensive, and it's either landed them in court or at least got them into some kind of hot water somewhere along the line, whether as part of a comedy stand-up routine at a club or a stage play, a TV show, or I dare say on plenty of occasions just people down the pub making jokes. So it's become a bit of an issue that goes on. In terms of where this relates to Druidry, we know that in the ancient world there was a subsection of the priesthood referred to as the bards in Wales and as the Fili in Ireland. And that within that subsection there was another group, or a kind of a specialist branch, or whatever you want to call it, who studied the arts of satire, and there were various laws and rules regarding the use of satire. As well as the specialists, we also have reasonable evidence that it was a skill that probably all bards or Fili used, at least learnt, if they whether they had a cause to use it or not is a separate issue, but they knew how to do it. So, for example, there is a myth about Cairbre, who is a famous in Ireland bard, who visits the court of King Breis the Beautiful, so called because he is very, very good looking, sort of Brad Pitt of his day, I suppose. Normally, the expectation would be that a visiting poet, a visiting performer would be given a room for the night, food, drink, a little money, some sort of reward for entertaining the amassed throng within the king's hall. We know this because of this book called the Oruchek Naria, which I suppose you could almost look upon this as a sort of early version of a trade union manual, which details the requirements to be placed on various professions, including bards, as they move up the ranks of skill. Almost all professions at that point in history had 7 ranks of skill that they moved up. That to qualify as this rank, they would need to know X, Y, and Z things and be able to do these various different skills. To qualify at the next rank, they needed to have these additional skills. So it's, in some respects, a little bit like a kind of university handbook saying what you need to learn to have an A level, an O level, a undergraduate degree, a postgraduate degree within a given profession. But also it gives the expectation of what you could charge, how you can expect to be treated, what sort of retinue you could take around with you in terms of followers if you were paying a formal official visit to someone such as an aristocrat. So it's quite a curious little book. I'm sure at some point in the more distant past there was a description of what was expected of the Druids per se, but that bit had not entered into this written manuscript. By the time this was written down, Ireland was becoming more and more Christianised, and this was written down by monks. And so whilst they recorded things connected to blacksmiths and carpenters and bishops and so on, they weren't recording things connected to explicitly pagan priesthoods. A lot of the bards had gone over to Christianity by this point, the Feely rather had gone over to Christianity, so that was a sort of an acceptable career to record the details of. I said there were laws regarding satire. If you bear with me a second, I'm just making a Black Forest gatto for friends and relatives who are coming over for Easter Sunday dinner. I just need to work out how much flour I need. There we go. Right. Where was I? Yes. So there were laws regarding the uses of satire. You couldn't just satirise anyone on a whim. The law codes refer to the fact that there had been people in the past who had misused the power of satire as a tool for blackmail or personal spite. And this is something that they were dead against happening. They wanted to put a stop to. So going back to the story of Cabra, to give you an idea of why they had laws specifically, when Cabra is badly treated by Brez the Beautiful, he turns up at this palace, he does his performance piece, and instead of being rewarded and fed and watered, he's shoved in a sort of flea-raddled, grotty, cold room. He gets hardly anything to eat, hardly anything to drink. He feels really quite ill-used. So, at the end of it, he walks away from Brez the Beautiful in high dudgeon and uses satire to curse him. So satire isn't just saying sarcastic things at people. In the Druid context, it's powerful enough to curse. It's just the neighbours screaming at each other. And the nature of this particular curse is that Brez the Beautiful, the vain, the handsome, this Brad Pitt of Ancient Ireland, comes out in a plague of boils all over his body and is horribly disfigured, which I'm sure is very painful and very unpleasant in and of itself. But there is also yet another rule that said a disfigured king could no longer serve as king. It's the same rule that requires Nuatha, when he loses his hand in battle, to abdicate, that he has to step down in favour of someone who is complete and entire in their body. So Brez not only gets this very unsightly and probably very itchy and very unpleasant curse laid upon him, but in effect he loses his kingship as a result of the curse placed upon him. So this isn't just sarcasm as rude words, this is powerful stuff. How much cocoa do we need? No, just going in. Right, okay. So if you contextualise it in that manner, just move the coke on. There we go. If you contextualise it in a manner, it's strong stuff. There are recordings of various ways in which curses can be laid upon people, and they are very, very elaborate, some quite ridiculously so. You might argue that they are that elaborate, perhaps in order to discourage people from just doing it on a whim. And the law certainly recognised at the time that an unfair satire, that is to say, to ridicule someone for a thing they hadn't actually done, was illegal. It's in effect rather like libel or slander laws of this day and age, in that you can't go around willy-nilly accusing people of anything you feel like, despite directors and owners of tabloids, editors of tabloids doing exactly that on a regular basis. But the law at that point said you had to only use satire where it was justified. So you could certainly accuse and ridicule someone for doing a thing they had done. That was perfectly acceptable, perfectly legitimate. But it was the humiliating of people for things they hadn't done that the law stepped in on, because it was seen as so powerful. Not only did it have the capacity to disfigure people, but there are various accounts talking about the power that some satirists had to kill outright by the power of their words. And even if you don't take that too literally, in this day and age, it's difficult to imagine anyone, unless they've got a really major heart condition and have a seizure upon hearing the rude things said about them, it's difficult to imagine the power of words outright killing just like that on the spot. But in a tribal society where your personal reputation is everything, is central to your social standing, your capacity to represent your tribe, to hold office, to make business contracts and good deals with people, they've got to trust you and so forth, where marrying off your sons and daughters to various other people depends on your having a good reputation, your family having a good reputation. To get a bad reputation becomes very, very destructive indeed. It can tear someone's social status down completely. And maybe living with that sort of thing for a few months or even a few years, seeing everything you've built up ripped to pieces, ripped away from you, maybe by the end of it you are stood on the edge of a riverbank thinking about chucking yourself in. And it may not cause you death in the sort of mystic, point the finger and they keel over dead sense, but it could destroy someone's mental balance. It could, in that day and age, destroy someone's livelihood, their social standing, make life no longer worth living for them. Maybe eventually even result in their exile, which would be tantamount to being dead for an awful lot of people at that point in time. So it was quite heavy-duty stuff. That's in the past, obviously. We'll never know the full 100% details of how that one worked. But moving forward to the modern age, what do we understand by this idea now in the 21st century? Those of a certain age will no doubt remember spitting image, which, well, of a certain age and of a certain nationality will remember spitting image. If you are too young to remember it, or you don't have a TV set in the first place, excuse me, it's just the dog wanting to go out, or you live in a country where it was never screened on TV in the first place, spitting image was a puppet show a couple of decades back for adults, in which all of the puppets were very caricatured images of celebrities, politicians, that sort of thing. And the whole thing was a comedy show just ripping the mickey out of the rich, the famous, the powerful, the pompous. It's very difficult for people of my generation to think about Margaret Thatcher, former Prime Minister of Great Britain, without immediately imagining the spitting image puppet of her as this mad-eyed harridan, screeching at her cabinet members. Such is the power of TV satire in that way, that you can almost no longer see the actual person. What you see when you bring them to mind is the satirical version of them. There was an impressionist called Stephen Niall, I think, who used to dress up as Margaret Thatcher and do a very good, very funny impersonation of her. And that has, I have to admit, quite heavily influenced my recollection of Margaret Thatcher as well. Smash. So, if we're using satire in this day and age, obviously the likelihood of anyone actually keeling over dead is, well, minimal, thankfully. That's not something we necessarily want to go back to. I just mislaid one of my ingredients, there we go. But it could have the power to ruin someone's career. It could have the power to ruin someone's life, to poison off their relationships, to make them seem like a deeply untrustworthy, dislikable individual, to denigrate them in all manner of ways, which makes their life very, very difficult from that point onwards. So it's something that even in this day and age we should use cautiously and sparingly, so that much as in ancient Ireland with the Brehon laws, we don't see the innocent being targeted. Targeted for things that they haven't actually done. That it's only used against those who deserve to have it used against them. The nature of the satire, obviously, is a very public sort of a magic. If you want to think of more stereotypical things, sticking pins in dollies and all that kind of nonsense, people can do that in complete private and nobody else need ever know they've done it. If you believe that magic works, and I appreciate that not all pagans do, a lot of pagans have a very sort of 21st century view of magic and regard it as more metaphor, symbolic, what have you. But if you believe it works, then it wouldn't be necessary for the victim of the dolly with the pins in it to know it's happening for it to take effect. A satire doesn't work like that. The whole point of a satire is that other people know what's going on. They've heard the satire, or if it's something on TV or what have you, cartoon in the newspapers, something like that, they've seen it. That is the power of satire, is that it is shared with other people. And they share it with others and share it with others. And obviously in this day and age, with things like Facebook and other forms of social media where people cut and paste and share stuff and bounce it around the planet forevermore, it takes on a whole new level of power, in that whilst one person may start it, it then ripples out and a million people make it happen by sharing and sharing and sharing, and the individual being scorned suffers because of it. Or do they? This is a question to contemplate, in that we are now in a day and age, in Britain we've seen it plenty of times. I'm sure if you are listening to this from some other country, you'll probably be able to think of examples of similar things in your country, because it seems to be a fairly much a worldwide phenomenon. But over here you'll have a politician from whichever party, it doesn't matter if it's the Tories in charge or the Labour in charge, they're all much of a muchness when it comes to this, where some politician will be caught doing something pretty shoddy and appalling. They'll be given the backing of the Prime Minister, which inevitably means they're sacked a week later. And having been sacked, a week after that, they get re-employed on some cushy government job, a quango, at an enormously inflated wage, so that they are kept part of the old boys, or if you prefer old girls, network. They are maintained in that system. So rather than being given the order of the boot and ending up on the unemployment queue, they just swap jobs. Because no matter how badly behaved politicians are, there is this sort of network of self-interest which seeks to look after the shamed, the outcast, the embarrassed. To put it another way, shame no longer has quite the role it used to have, and satire is contingent on the existence of shame. Now, we live in an age where the social justice warrior movement has been in swing for a couple of years now, and they'll people who sort of are passionate about that will often get very aerated about things like fat shaming and slut shaming and gay shaming and pill shaming is a thing I heard the other day. This idea that shame is a weapon used to oppress people who don't deserve to be oppressed. Which is certainly true. Shame has been used in all sorts of contexts, some of them quite horrible, to embarrass and degrade people who haven't actually necessarily done much of anything. Because someone is overweight, is that a reason to point at them and laugh and be horrible to them? To paraphrase J.K. Rowling's, is if the worst thing you can say about another human being is that they've put on a few pounds, then that's not really an insult. It's the people who are vicious and cruel and sadistic who need the finger pointing at them, not people who are just slightly on the large side. So things like fat shaming, you can make the argument, yes, this is destructive, psychologically destructive, is unhealthy. If you've been sniped at 1,000 times over during the course of your lifetime, it becomes very caustic and it wears you down and so on. But in chucking out negative forms of shaming, we might wonder, have we also somewhere along the line chucked out socially constructive shaming? So like those politicians who lie and cheat and do really dodgy, sleazy things, and have so little sense of shame about it that they're back in a job a week later, and whose colleagues have so little sense of collective shame that they will enable them to get back into a job a week later, that's an area where people ought to feel ashamed, where they actually have done something crappy, something awful. And this is the whole point of a satire, is that the individual really has done something crappy. something they ought to be made ashamed of. And the job of the satirist is to stand up and go, "Oi, you, stop it. This is what you've done. You are no longer going to hide behind wealth, power, family connections, whatever it is that the person hides behind. I am going to bring your dirty little secret out into public and make it widely known to other people what you get up to, what horrible tawdry thing you do. And until the day you stop doing that horrible tawdry thing, I'll go on repeating it and repeating it and repeating it." That is, I would add, going back to the social media issue, maybe a subject that has changed in context. Forgot about this. In our social media driven age. In that things get repeated and shared and recycled and round and round and round and round and round it goes ad nauseum, long after things have ceased to be relevant. In the same way that you'll find people going, "Oh my God, so and so famous person has died," and when you look at the details of the death, they've probably been dead for 5 years, and that individual's only just found out. They've shared some news item about the famous person dying, not realising how out of date it is. And it's the same to an extent with this whole naming shaming business online, is that once it's on things like Twitter and Facebook and all the rest of it, it can go round and round and round forever, even years and years and years after that person has either died and is no longer around to be ashamed, or years and years after they have reformed and changed their character and mended their ways. And that is a particularly critical issue, I think, for satire. Whereas in the ancient world, a bard, once they'd learnt that an individual had changed their ways, could simply stop singing the rude songs and telling the naughty poems and what have you about the shameful individual. If you slap that kind of stuff up on social media, it is there forever. There is no shelf life. The way the system is designed doesn't mean it doesn't enable stories to die after a certain period. They just go round and round and round, and that is a real difficulty, because in a system of justice there has to be room for rehabilitation. There has to be capacity for someone to say, "Yes, all right, fair enough, I was a complete git 5 years ago, I did this terrible thing, I shouldn't have done it, I now realise I shouldn't have done it, and I am now a much better person." And I think once somebody can genuinely, hand on heart, say, "I am now a much better person," not just as a PR job, but they really have changed, that it then becomes quite unjust, quite unfair for them to go on and on and on and on being pilloried. So any system of justice, whether that is dealt with in the pagan context of satire, or in a more formal legal sense, or in any other sense for that matter, has to have that allowance for people to change, for people to rehabilitate. Otherwise, what's the damn point? If you're going to plague someone forever and ever more, you may as well just put a bullet in their head and be done with it. Because they never will be able to get away from the twitching curtains, the pointing fingers, the embarrassment that follows them. So, to recapitulate, this is going in the cake, it's not going in there. Not yet, anyway. The notion of satire, first of all, requires people to have a sense of humour and find things funny. And let's face it, in this world, that's an increasingly smaller and smaller and smaller group of people. Second, it requires the person targeted by the satire to have a sense of shame, a sense of the need for a good social reputation, good social standing, acceptance in the eyes of their community, where they can't just stick two fingers up to their community and say, "Screw you, I don't care what you think, I'm going to blunder on regardless, making everyone's life a misery." If you live in a society in which that is a possibility, then satire has already lost its power before it's even started. And I do increasingly worry that maybe we have created that very sort of society for ourselves. And when I say we, I don't And it's not exactly pointing the finger at you, whoever it is that's listening to this, and saying you created this. But every single one of us chips in at some level, no matter how tiny, no matter how small, to either enable something awful to happen around us, or to actively take part in making it happen. Let's put it like this: if you've got I'm assuming that most of the people listening to this are probably going to be pagan, but you're part of a pagan community, or even if you're not pagan at all, you're part of some other community. There will be individuals in it who are not very nice. If your community is of any size at all, that's inevitable, isn't it? That you're going to get dodgy characters coming along. Once those dodgy characters come along, they might start treating other people badly. In paganism, the jargon term is often witch wars, even if you're not witch. It's one of these catchy phrases, where this person falls out with that person, there's screaming abdabs, usually about very little indeed. And it accelerates, and you get this kind of playground mentality where if you're my friend, so you can't be their friend, and all that rubbish goes on. I've seen it no end of times. I've been on the receiving end of it a few times. It happens. If you've got someone who really is treating others genuinely badly, the question becomes, what does the community, i.e. you, do about it? Do you just say to yourself, well, they're not being horrible to me, so I don't care. None of my business, just get on with it, be horrible to people. Shrug your shoulders and walk away, because if you do that, you are effectively allowing warfare to rage on. Peace is created not only by the two warring armies sitting down, talking to each other, coming to compromise and so forth, but it also requires the wider communities around them to make that peace happen. Now, whether we're talking warfare as spears and arrows or bombs and bullets, whatever, flying about, or we're talking a war of words and just people waving their handbags at each other and being horrible and unpleasant, conflict requires more than just the two people or two governments, to whoever it is involved, to calm the hell down and negotiate and discuss and work out, where do we go from here? What's the next move forward? What are we going to do to make the world a more peaceful place? So it becomes a sort of collective responsibility, a collective effort. Something we all need to take part in. Even if we're never directly affected by the feuding and the handbag waving. Unfortunately, a lot of communities, I'm pretty sure that paganism is by no means the only community that has this sort of issue. There's always people who go for the quiet life option, say, oh well, so-and-so has never been horrible to me, therefore I won't take part, I won't get involved. Trouble is, even this option of not being involved means that you are then involved, but you're involved in a very unhelpful way. Because if you are part, unless you actually move away from the community entirely, you're going to be part of it. There's going to be people with hurt feelings on one side and people crowing about whatever crappy things they've done on the other side. That's not going to go away just because you don't want to be involved with it. Whether satire is the way to go with that, no, I've tried it. It does sometimes. Sometimes it works. Whether it's the best and most effective way of resolving those sorts of problems, that's a moot point. Before I move on to the next bit, Ray Bradbury wrote a book called Something Wicked This Way Comes, which is a children's horror story, but like a lot of children's stories, it's not entirely a children's story, if you see what I mean. It has a lot of subtext to it. In that story, a fun fair comes to town. This is a spoiler, by the way, so stick your fingers in your ears if you don't want this particular book spoilt for you. The fun fair comes to town and there's various villainous characters. Mr. Midnight, I think, was one of them. It's a while since I read it. who uses menace and threat and intimidation to have a horrible impact and influence over the lives of people in the town. The story is told from the perspective of a couple of kids who are witnessing what's going on and kind of getting drawn into the mystery and the mayhem of the fun fair and all of the sort of circus and what have you attached to it. They eventually discover at the end, and this is the spoiler bit, that the best way to defeat Mr. Midnight is to laugh at him. He becomes a figure of humour, a figure of fun. The more ridiculous he becomes in their eyes, the less of a threat he poses to them, the less intimidating he is, the less monstrous he is, the more sort of pathetic and laughable he becomes. There's in a similar sort of vein, there's an Agatha Christie story called Appointment with Death, and I won't give any spoilers, but it involves a particular character who is a monster, sadistic, vicious tyrant who has other characters in the story living in fear. By the end of the book, those characters have come to see that tyrant not so much as the dreadful monster they imagined at the start, but as laughable, as pathetic, as someone for whom they now start to feel pity that they were just this little tin pot tyrant whose only sense of self-importance was lauding it as a very, very big fish in a tiny little pond. And whilst it's not full-on humour in that sense, they're not kind of going, ha ha ha, you're funny, but they are nonetheless seeing her as seeing the character, no spoilers, seeing the character as a deflated figure rather than this huge puffed up, threatening, intimidating figure, and that is largely what satire was in the old Druidic sense. It wasn't just about having a good belly laugh and saying, oh, you're so ridiculous, you're so silly. It was also about no longer being afraid of someone who posed some kind of a threat, some kind of a danger, an insult, a destabilising force in some shape, guise or form to others. And so the act of satirising them took away their power, it deflated them. It made them less of a menace, as well as shaming them for behaving like a menace in the first place. Which is quite an interesting one, because it's very much, if you like, satire in that sense is directed principally, primarily, against the powerful. You could, of course, satirise someone who has very little power. You could satirise a homeless person in the streets, somebody like that, with no power whatsoever. But you'd have to ask yourself, what would be the point of doing that? What would that achieve? Because the whole notion of satire is that it's a weapon you can use where no other weapons are available. So, as with Kebra and Brez the Beautiful, the king, he couldn't go and stick a sword in the king, he couldn't go and chuck a spear at him. His weapon became his words. That was his way of taking away the power of the king, of literally taking away the power, because he wasn't a king by the end of it, he'd lost his kingship. So it would be unfair, if you like, to use satire as a weapon against those who have no power, because they've got nothing to take away. It's a weapon against those whom you cannot deal with by any other routes, except to try and remove their power, remove their threat, their menace, through the use of clever words, the use of clever imagery, of mocking poetry, of getting other people to laugh at them, and instead of being intimidated by them or threatened by them or having to kowtow to them, they come to stand up against them, they come to see them in a much more negative light, and to see through them, I suppose, arguably. If you've got someone who puts on a good front, and you as the satirists know something about them, you can sort of puncture that mask of respectability and show whatever is festering underneath, then it's also about removing the glamour from other people's eyes, so that they can see this individual for the kind of creature they are. But as per the old Brown laws, it's a power that has to be used fairly and wisely, so that no one is being unduly abused or intimidated or ill-treated, or maligned in any way for something they haven't actually done, something that's not their responsibility. And it has to be done, and this is where it gets, I think, really difficult, as I was saying before about social media. How do you do that in this day and age of social media in such a way that people can rehabilitate?